I'll go all the way down. Here. I'll duck down.
Hello.
This rivals a presidential press conference, George.
Very similar.
It's for you or Barack.
For
George,
do a
you're
lot of
supposed to
fancy
be.
people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Really? Okay.
Senator? President.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank you for having me. 60 seconds?
Sure.
Where do we have the,
Okay, Nancy.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Jonathan Salant, president of the club and reporter for Bloomberg News. We have a very special newsmaker today. I'd like to introduce Melissa Charbonneau, who will be the moderator today. And thank you, Melissa, for setting this up.
Thank you. On behalf of the Newsmakers Committee today, I'd like to introduce today's newsmaker, who needs little introduction based on the massive response we've gotten from this event. He is actor, director, and Academy Award winner George Clooney. Mr. Clooney comes to us today straight off a trip this week from the Sudan. He went there to tour the war-torn region of Darfur, an area that for the past 3 years we've been getting reports of some of the worst human atrocities and mass killings of our time. Mr. Clooney has worked over the past year, as you know, on issues related to Africa. He has traveled last summer to the G8 summit as the spokesman for the One campaign, where he worked along with Bono to successfully appeal for increased aid to Africa. There's some of the groups that have worked with Mr. Clooney on African issues here to our right. You will see many of the organizations, NGOs, and we'd like to recognize them. Thank you for being here. One of them is the Save Darfur Coalition that will be holding a rally on the National Mall this Sunday to protest the atrocities in the Sudan and appeal to the public to end that genocide. Also, we'd like to recognize Mr. Clooney's parents who are with us today, Mr. Clooney's father also, Lee Sander. You're back there? Lovely. Your father, I understood, spent the 10 days with you in the Sudan, so we're glad you're here. And also joining us are two men who have been leaders in the U.S. Senate on this issue, Senator Barack Obama of Illinois and Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas. These senators have co-sponsored legislation, the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act, and have lobbied for increased funding for peacekeeping operations in the Sudan. Now to our newsmaker. We'd like to turn now to hear his personal response to what he witnessed on the ground in Darfur. Please help me welcome George Clooney.
Hello. Thank you very much. I'm not very comfortable giving speeches on the political stage, so I'll make this quick. In the tradition of Hollywood, you will all be getting gift baskets with signed autographs of Senator Obama and Senator Brownback and myself. And we threw in some signed photos of Scott McClellan, too, that were piled up outside. Look, I'm the last person in the world that should come up and tell people what they should or shouldn't do. We have senators for that. 5 days ago, my father and I were on the border of Chad and Darfur. We were watching the refugees spilling into the camps. Some 2 years after President Bush and Colin Powell officially declared these atrocities genocide. September 7th, 2004, the House of Representatives unanimously passed the declaration of genocide in Darfur and called for the U.S. government to, number one, assume responsibility to act and stop genocide, to consider leading a multilateral or even unilateral intervention to stop the violence in Darfur, or to impose sanctions, visa bans, and asset freezes on the Sudanese Congress and individual leaders. Now, we've had some success, but not much success following through on all of these. We had some this week, actually. It's not that we don't have the intent. Everyone has a good reason not to act. The government is our government is stretched, certainly financially. We're stretched militarily. The UN doesn't want to step on the African Union's feet. The Sudanese government isn't looking for us to come into their country. NATO is worn down, obviously, from Afghanistan. There's no easy answer to this. But what we cannot do is turn our heads and look away and hope that this will somehow disappear. Because if we do, they will. They will disappear. And an entire generation of people will be gone. And then only history will be left to judge us, like Rwanda and like the Balkans, Cambodia. While we were there, my father and I, there wasn't much to eat in Bahai, obviously, so I eventually got around to eating goat, which is what they eat. It took me a period of time, but got around to it. And the next day, the goat was taking its revenge on me, and we were in Ori Kasoni, which is a camp there, and I was sort of kneeled down behind a tent, feeling pretty sorry for myself. And this little tiny waif of a girl, little elf of a young woman, came over and she started saying, "Okay," to me. "Okay, okay," which I think was the only thing she could speak in English. And I gave her a thumbs up, which I was, it's fairly embarrassing. And then she said to me in Arabic, "When will you come back? And when will you stop this?" And I told the translator to tell her soon. We'll be there soon. And then she sort of laughed. She was holding on my finger, and she laughed, and she said, "That's what you always say." It wasn't even sad. I mean, that was life for her. It's not a political issue. There's no right or left. There is no conservative or liberal point of view. There is only right or wrong. It is the first genocide of the 21st century. The president wants to put a stop to it. Congress wants to put a stop to it. The UN wants to put a stop to it. What they need now is the American people and the world's population to help them, to tell them that it matters that much to us, that it's that important to us. We have an 800 number that you can call. We're going to have rallies this Sunday in Washington and San Francisco and all around the country. We have an emergency supplemental bill coming up in Congress. We have the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act in Congress. And we have some very important senators working on this. I'm going to show you very quickly some tape of what we did. There's not a lot of new news here, except the fact that it's still going on 2 years later. You'll excuse the first minute. We've sort of tried to put into context what's going on for those people who don't know what's going on. And then the next couple of minutes are my father and I traveling first through the south of Sudan on the border of Darfur, and then we moved up to the north into Chad. And we'll just run that if you want. Or not. The Sudan is a country in North Africa with a population of 40 million people. It has long been a nation ruled by fundamentalist Islamic leaders who believe only those born of Arab descent are pure Muslims. Darfur, a region in the west of Sudan, is home to 6 million Muslims of African descent. For decades, the African Muslims in Darfur were treated as second-class citizens, systematically kept powerless and in poverty. In 2003, to protest the Arab-dominated government's abuse and oppression of the people of Darfur, African rebels attacked the military outpost. 2 weeks later, the Sudanese government unleashed armed Arab tribal militias. The mission? To not only kill those who planned the uprising, but wipe out their entire race. The government-sponsored murdering militias are known as the Janjaweed, Arab for evil on horseback. For 3 years, the Janjaweed have burned a path through the entire Darfur region, torching villages, livestock, and farms, gang-raping women and children, and slaughtering entire families in cold blood. The United Nations calls the genocide in Sudan today's greatest humanitarian crisis. Nearly 400,000 dead, millions homeless and on the brink of starvation, all as the world turns a blind eye. Right now we're standing here on the border of Chad and Darfur. A lot of bad things are happening over here right now. My father and I thought we'd come over and take a look for ourselves. We started in South Sudan. It took 2 days to get to the border of Darfur. We heard there were a lot of refugees pouring south. We found a village called Jacques with over 1,000 displaced families. This isn't a refugee camp. There are no tents to shelter them. Most just sleep under trees. No food, no water. These people had jobs and property before the Arab Janjaweed militia burned their villages, raped their women, and killed their children.
When this violence occurred, did you know immediately who was responsible? Let me ask you.
Darfur is a nickname to this Janjaweed sponsored by the state there.
That's right. Back in Darfur, did you personally lose any relatives or friends who were killed in the insurgency that was mounted against you?
أنا شخصيا فاقد مني 9 أنفار. From him personally, he lost 9 from his immediate family members.
9 dead from your family?
Yeah.
أنا 7.
You lost 7 family members. How did you lose them? Do you know?
أنا راقد في الليل كده. في الليل.
At night we were sleeping, and then we had a gunshot, and then we got scattered. When we came back, we found they were dead.
So someone came in and shot them, shot your relatives.
Was there bombing first by any planes before the Janjaweed, or was it just the Janjaweed?
It happened at night. They were sleeping, and then they had gunshot, so they couldn't do exactly whether it was a bomb or it was what. But people were dying because of the gunshot, so they just ran away from that place. So they can't find out exactly whether it was a bombardment or.
Were they singling out any gender? Were they going after women or men, or was it just sort of just in general attack?
Children, kids, women, so they were not differentiating.
Since the government of Sudan won't let anyone into Darfur, including UN officials, we traveled north to Chad. Not great timing on our part, since Chad was in the midst of a coup. We landed in N'Djamena, where 9 days earlier, armed rebels stormed the city. Having failed, they moved east towards Abeche. So did we. On the border of Darfur is a refugee camp called Ori Kasoni, 29,000 survivors of the massacre in Sudan. There we met a girl named Jillian, who helped start the camp over 2 years ago. When people first started showing up here, how many a day were coming in at the time?
Hundreds. I mean, on some days we'd have 500 people coming in, other days it would be less. But especially for the first 3 months, it was hundreds of people coming across the border every day.
Hundreds of people, mostly from Darfur?
All from Darfur.
All from Darfur. All basically attacked by, in Darfur?
Yes, all attacked in Darfur, either aerial bombardments or actual Janjaweed coming into their villages and having to travel for days or weeks to cross the border into Chad.
Did you encounter a number of people who lost family members?
Absolutely. Almost every family has some story about losing family members, either during the original raid or on the road here. And of course they lost all their possessions. They all had to leave very quickly and just came with what they could carry.
The problem of the government, she wants to kill everybody, just Sudan to become Arab people, Arab country, not for the black people, just for the Arab people. So that is the objective of the Sudan government.
What do you want to happen to fix this?
Now there is United Nations. There are many international NGOs. So I like them to get up, to try as soon as possible to solve this problem, because Sudan government, not the Sudan, just want to kill all the black people in Africa.
A lot of the reason behind sexual attack is to humiliate and to pound down a people as a whole.
And ruin the chances of them having children again and later.
Right, and destroy families.
Destroy family. And did you come across many of those here?
Yeah, almost every family has a story about somebody who was attacked sexually within their family or a close friend.
Those of us of a certain age, like me, may have thought they had seen the end of such things as displaced persons and refugee camps 50 years ago, places where the cruelest death of all may be the death of hope. But hope is stubborn, even in a place like this. There are scores of Ore Casones on both sides of the border. 2 million people away from their own homes. Time is running out.
On that note, I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Senator Barack Obama.
Well, first of all, let me just thank George Clooney, his father, for making this trip and highlighting what's taking place there. You know, George and I haven't known each other long. I've admired him from afar. I think his singular ability to focus on this issue and then actually be informed about it and be able to speak passionately about it and invest the kind of commitment that's reflected on that screen is remarkable. And so I'm appreciative, and I think it'll make a difference. There are a couple of other people I want to acknowledge in the audience. I believe Christina Norman is here. Christina? Christina is the president of MTV, and she has done, you know, MTV has done terrific work in terms of publicizing this issue, and so I just want to personally thank you and your station for the work that you've done. Joe Madison's here, the Black Eagle from WOLAM and XM, the Power. Joe's going to be emceeing Sunday, and you know, he has been on this issue for years now, doing outstanding work, and I wanted to especially commend him for keeping the focus on this, and to the entire coalition that is helping to put this rally together on Sunday. Thank you for not just this Sunday, but the work that you've been doing all across the country. And finally, I've got to give a special acknowledgement to the person. She's technically on my staff right now only because she actually thought that I might be able to do something on issues that she cared about. But she's actually on the faculty at Harvard. I'm lucky to have her for a year. She's a wonderful friend and has written a book that I'd recommend to everybody called A Problem from Hell, which is about the history of genocide. And she's written some wonderful articles for The New Yorker about the situation in Darfur, and that's Samantha Power. Samantha, can you just... And then, of course, Sam Brownback, who's a terrific colleague and has been consistent and passionate about this issue in terrific ways. I think the fact that Sam and I are the co-sponsors of the Darfur Accountability Act underscores something that George said. You know, in conventional Washington parlance, Sam is considered one of the more conservative members of our Senate. I'm considered one of the more liberal. But we share a passion around this issue. It goes beyond ideology. And I think when we see what will be happening at the Sunday rally, what you will see is a gathering of an assortment of people, you know, young people from colleges, senior citizens who've taken this up as an issue. You will see evangelical Christian communities that are focused on this and have been consistently on the right side of this issue, as well as secular humanists who believe in doing the right thing. And I think that gives me hope. But we've got a lot of work to do. All I'm going to do right now before we go to questions and answers is just address a couple of critical points. My understanding today is that we saw helicopter gunships going into Darfur, conducting bombing attacks, aerial attacks, raids, further displacing people and sending them fleeing. This has not stopped. There have been times where the international community has been surprised about what is taking place and can excuse itself for inaction by saying we didn't know. This is not one of those circumstances. This is being filmed. It's being documented. People have written about it. It is a slow-rolling genocide. And the notion that we are going to stand by in the face of this is unacceptable. And I think it's unacceptable to the American people, and my hope is it's unacceptable to the international community. But we have to be smart about how we move this forward. There are some very concrete, specific things that need to be done if we're to provide relief to the people that were on that screen, and if we're going to start a cycle of renewal and reversal of the terrible atrocities that have been taking place. The most important thing that's needed right now on the ground is a UN protection force. The African Union has done a wonderful job with limited resources to try to serve as witness and a buffer between the Janjaweed and communities in Darfur. But they have 7,000 people for the largest country in Africa. The Darfur region alone is the size of France. And they don't have boots, they don't have Black Hawks, they don't have equipment, they don't have much airlift capacity. They have an unclear mandate in terms of what they're allowed to do in repelling aggression by the Janjaweed. They have to be supplemented by a larger force, and we anticipate that we would need at least 20,000 troops on the ground who are properly equipped to work in concert with the African Union in order to provide a much more significant protection barrier between them and the Janjaweed. Okay. Now, in order to set up that protection force, we have to start now getting a mandate from the United Nations Security Council and lining up the contributor nations who are actually going to send in the troops. Oftentimes we assume that the United Nations has a bunch of troops lying around just ready to go. That's not how it works. Essentially, hat in hand, Kofi Annan and others, once he gets a mandate, has to go individually, country by country, to the Pakistanis or the Bangladeshis or the Nepalese or whoever, and say to them, will you please contribute troops? That's a 6-month process just to get those commitments. I should add, by the way, that UN peacekeeping has suffered as a consequence of the middle powers, countries like Canada and Australia and others that have much more capacity, basically washing their hands of peacekeeping in Africa. They don't think at this point that it's worth the trouble. And so typically you've got poor nations trying to provide some help to even poor nations. But that process has to begin. It's going to take 6 months, and we may not have 6 months. I was on Charlie Rose with Jan England, who's the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs. And Jan, who was not allowed, by the way, the Khartoum government blocked him from visiting some of the current camps, pointed out that if you started seeing significant violence directed at the volunteers who are doing humanitarian work, they would be forced to pull out. The NGOs that are there, the non-governmental organizations that are there, understandably are going to have to pull their volunteers out. You could see in the span of 2 weeks suddenly wholesale famine when you've got 2 million people who are entirely reliant on humanitarian aid. The point I'm making is that we don't have necessarily 6 months. We certainly don't have the time to dither for the next 4 or 5 or 6 months, finally get some sort of Security Council resolution, then start another 6-month process of getting the UN troops together. All this means that the United States, as the single remaining superpower in the world, has to take the kind of diplomatic initiative that it has not been taking so far. The Bush administration has been better than the Europeans on this issue, but better is not good enough. And it is going to be absolutely critical that we say we're going to use some political capital We are going to devote significant diplomatic energy to making sure that UN resolutions pass, making sure that a special envoy is sent to start peace talks between rebels and Khartoum government, and that most importantly, we create a safety zone for the folks who are already there. The only other point I'll make, and then I'll turn it over to Sam, it's important for us to realize that the rebels in this process are not faultless. Many of those who are opposed to the Khartoum government have now been engaged in some pretty bad stuff themselves. They're disorganized, they don't seem to have a clear agenda, they're splintered, and so setting up the kinds of peace talks that are needed is going to be a cumbersome process. There's been talk by the African Union and others that we shouldn't send a UN peacekeeping force in until that those peace talks proceed. We don't have time to do that. These things have to move on parallel tracks. We do, if we want to solve the problem permanently, have to have peace talks in place. But in the interim, we've got to go ahead and get this protection force in. Sam Brownback has been an outstanding colleague, and Sam, maybe what you could do is fill in some of the things we're trying to do in Congress on this issue.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Jonathan Salant, president of the club and reporter for Bloomberg News. We have a very special newsmaker today. I'd like to introduce Melissa Charbonneau, who will be the moderator today. And thank you, Melissa, for setting this up.
Thank you. On behalf of the Newsmakers Committee today, I'd like to introduce today's newsmaker, who needs little introduction based on the massive response we've gotten. There's some of the groups that have worked with Mr. Clooney on African issues here to our right. You will see many of the organizations, NGOs, and we'd like to recognize them. Thank you for being here. One of them is the Save Darfur Coalition that will be holding a rally on the National Mall this Sunday to protest the atrocities in the Sudan and appeal to the public to end that genocide. Also, we'd like to recognize Mr. Clooney's parents who are with us today, Mr. Clooney's father also, Lee Sander. You're back there? Lovely. Your father, I understood, spent the 10 days with you in the Sudan, so we're glad you're here. And also joining us are two men who have been leaders in the...
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Hello. Where are we going, over there? Sure, I'll go all the way down. Here. I'll duck down.
Hello. It's the arrivals of presidential press conference, George.
Very similar.
It's for you or Barack? For George, you're supposed to be.
From this event. He is actor, director, and Academy Award winner George Clooney. Mr. Clooney comes to us today straight off a trip this week from the Sudan. He went there to tour the war-torn region of Darfur, an area that for the past 3 years we've been getting reports of some of the worst human atrocities and mass killings of our time. Mr. Clooney has worked over the past year, as you know, on issues related to Africa. He has traveled last summer to the G8 summit as the spokesman for the One campaign, where he worked along with Bono to successfully appeal for increased aid to Africa.